Hi, everybody. This is Stefan Molyneux from Freedom Main Radio. Hope you're doing well. So we're back with Dr. Kevin Beaver. He is a professor at Florida State University and is one of the preeminent researchers in the field of biosocial criminology. What is that, you ask? Fine question. We'll get into that in a moment. He's published over 150 articles, which is better than me because mine are all on Blogspot, more than 25 book chapters, and is the author or editor of 10 books, including Biosocial Criminology, a primer. Thanks, of course, Dr. Beaver, for having the time to chat today.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Okay, biosocial criminology. As you've written, it is the fastest growing line of research within the field of criminology and seems to be encountering just a smidgen of resistance from the established fortress of academia. Could you help my listeners just sort of understand what biosocial criminality is to begin with?
Sure, absolutely. So in the field of criminology, historically, really since the 1950s, 1960s, what we've seen is focus solely on how environmental factors produce criminal behavior. So looking at things ranging from the economy to cultures to subcultures to peers to parental socialization, virtually every single theory ever published and any empirical study ever published had focused only on the environment. And it was really only about 10 to 15 years ago where we started to see a change, and not just a change from environment to genetics, but a slower change where it wasn't just a focus on environments, but there was beginning to trickle into the field an interest in the possibility that individual differences in personality traits, temperament, things of that nature might also explain some differences in criminal behavior across people. And so I think that sort of set the stage a little bit for a small group of researchers to come in and begin to look at the possibility that genetic differences across people might account for part of the reason why individuals are different in terms of criminal behavior. And so that's sort of the historical backdrop, a short historical backdrop to sort of what led into biosocial criminology, but more generally speaking, or more specifically speaking, biosocial criminology is interested in examining all of the potential causes of crime, whether they be environmental, whether they be genetic, biological, whatever they might be. Biosocial criminologists will study all of those typically at the same time and in combination to see not only how, say, genes and the environment each contribute to criminal behavior, but also how they may interact, how they might modify each other to produce differences in the propensity to commit criminal behaviors.
Yeah, and I mean, certainly the way that I grew up intellectually, the idea was that human beings are sort of like this liquid, and you pour them into the environment and they just kind of merge. And then, of course, the argument that follows from that is, to some degree, at least politically, sort of social engineering, redistribution of income and so on is going to change outcomes. And the idea that we are a lot more fixed in our natures than people think. It's kind of a challenge to, I mean, more than just your field, but the entire way that we think. I mean, the idea that the Soviets could create the Soviet man, just change the economic environment and you get a new type of human being. That is a significant challenge. So what are the resistances that you're finding in the spread of this information?
Yeah, I think we get a lot of resistance and it stems from the fact that people don't fully understand how and in what ways genes work for complex human behaviors, but also failing to realize that many of the same criticisms that they level against biosocial criminology could be leveled against their own line of research. And so I'll give you a common sort of example. People will come and critique biosocial criminology by saying, oh, you're looking for a crime gene. And let's say you find a single gene that causes crime, and it's sort of a deterministic in nature. So if you have this gene, you'll become a criminal, and if you don't have this gene, you won't become a criminal. Well, what types of policy implications would flow from that? So they're sort of setting up a straw man because that's not how genes work, but they're looking at it as though genes are deterministic and that's a very dangerous approach. But what the logic of their theories rests upon is the belief that the environment's the only thing that matters, and that people are sculpted solely from the way in which they encounter different environments and from the different socialization that they receive. And so their belief is that for whatever reason it might be, they believe that the environmental explanations are sort of morally superior to genetic explanations, but the outcome is in many ways the same. That the genes are the only thing that matters according to them, or the environment's the only thing that matters according to them. And if you can think of the dangers that would sort of flow directly from this if they were correct and the environment was the only thing that matters, think about what that would mean. You could take, 100 or 100,000 people at birth and sculpt them into whoever you want them to be. They would obey you, they would listen, they would do whatever you want them to do solely because you have complete control over the way that they're socialized and the types of environments that they encounter. So there are many different sort of clashing views, if you will, between a biosocial perspective and an environmental perspective. But I would say that most of these disagreements stem largely from setting up a straw man, such as saying the only thing that matters is a single gene or the only thing that matters is genes. And then it frees sort of these critics up to make these arguments that seem like they hold some water, but when you sort of dissect them, clearly they fall apart because they're based on erroneous assumptions.
Yeah, and of course, the idea that the pursuit of truth should be conditioned by our perception of positive or negative outcomes is to say that the truth should be manipulated to give you the kind of world that you prefer, and that's more propagandistic, I would argue, than a pursuit of truth itself. And my argument for years has been that let's say that there's a family history of heart disease, and it's genetic. It's not because we eat a lot of fried food or whatever. I've got a genetic family history of heart disease. I would want to know that information, because if I don't know that information, it seems rather inevitable that I'm going to die of heart disease. But if I have that information, then I can take positive steps to counteract the genetic undermining of my heart health by more exercise, better food, whatever it is that I would do. So knowledge would give you power to avert an outcome that otherwise would be deterministic if you didn't have that knowledge.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. I always say very much the same thing, that knowledge is power. And the more that we understand the etiology of whatever it is we're studying, in this case criminal behavior, the better able we are to be in a position to do something about it. And I think that the point you made about sort of ideology or what's good or what's bad conditioning sort of what we study and what we believe is spot on. It may be noble for some people to say the only thing that matters is the environment, right? And they might think that this is a very progressive way of thinking, that this is a very sort of open way of thinking that allows everyone to be sort of treated somewhat equally, or at least come into the world equally. And that might be good for some people. It's not scientific, but it might make these individuals feel better about themselves or try to make others feel better. But let's say that we follow their logic, that this is sort of the more noble pathway. This is the more progressive way. It still doesn't tell us anything about the causes of crime. So if everybody sort of jumps on the bandwagon and say, wow, yeah, these environmental explanations are progressive and these biosocial explanations are oppressive, well, that doesn't tell us about the causes of crime. It might tell us which one makes us feel better. But if we truly don't understand the causes of crime, then we can't do anything about it. And so that's why I think when we look at the study of crime, a lot of times I'm tagged as a biosocial criminologist, and that's what I'd call myself. But really, what I see myself as is an objective empiricist, someone that evaluates the data, someone that examines research questions, and tries as much as they can to not let subjective or political ideologies penetrate into findings or penetrate into what I want to occur or the way I want a study to come out. I try to be objective as possible. And I think when we're talking about social science researchers and criminologists more specifically, that's very rare. I think that what we tend to see are certain ideologies, certain beliefs permeate the field. And if you publish research or if you show research findings that are supportive of that ideology, you're much more likely to be published. And if you go against the grain and you show research that challenges those views, you're much less likely to be published and much more likely to be held to a standard of science that probably most social scientists can't ever reach.
Oh yeah, so this is I think a good thing to touch on, which you've written a whole paper about, which is the peer review is supposed to be the gold standard. I kind of like the market review myself, as in can you sell it and does it have value to people else? But the peer review in sort of the academic scientific community is considered to be the gold standard. But it also seems to me that the peer review, particularly in the more difficult to quantify, like the softer sciences outside of physics and math and so on, that it can be used for a very conservative kind of gateway to protect an existing edifice of thought rather than everybody's got a bias, everybody's got a self-interest. And of course, people who've invested their careers in a particular worldview are not always the most friendly to ideas that challenge that worldview. Do you think that it's possible that the peer review process can be used as a gatekeeper to keep new ideas out of an existing structure?
Absolutely. There's no doubt. I mean, I've seen it firsthand. I've heard from others that have experienced some stuff that's very similar. I mean, if you think about what gives researchers in any particular discipline status is publications, but more than publications, it's publishing in top journals. And so what a lot of times, colleagues do is they'll evaluate how influential a researcher is, or sort of quote unquote how good of a researcher is, by looking at whether they publish in the field's top journals. Well, who are the editors of these journals? Well, sort of the big wigs, the big names, the more established folks in the field who have published sort of in this particular realm, whatever it is that they published in, but they published in a way that allowed them to move their way up the food chain, so that now they're the editors of these big journals. They're typically more established, full professors that have been around a long time, that have a solid publication record, and that are highly respected. Well, what happens then when other researchers come in and try to publish research that may go against the grain, that may go against everything that these editors have published in their career, or that may go against the entire field's ideology? They're much more likely to sack that paper. And it can be sort of a hidden way of doing it. It doesn't necessarily mean that the editor is going to write you back and say this paper is bad for these reasons. But any topic that researchers study, we can identify people who are for that particular finding and those who are against it. So if you publish a study, or you submit a study for publication, and it's testing theory A, whatever that theory might be, and it shows no support for that theory, an editor who ultimately selects the reviewers for that paper knows people who are for that theory and people who are against that theory. And so if you show no support for that theory, you could easily send that paper to 3 reviewers who are known proponents of that particular theory, and know full well that that paper is going to be sacked by those reviewers. So it sort of sets up this facade where editors can say, well, we're blind, we're just following what these reviewers say, and these are expert reviewers on this topic, and they all came back and said this paper was flawed in these ways, and we just followed the reviewer's advice and didn't publish that paper. And so it creates this facade, or this mirage that, look, we're being objective editors, when in reality we know that the editors are typically far from objective, at least within criminology, and that they have certain beliefs, they have certain findings that they want to get published, and it doesn't take much to hear backstories about an editor who likes this, or an editor who wants that, or an editor who's more open to publishing on this topic, or an editor that's more likely to publish a paper showing something that goes against the ideology, and so yeah, absolutely. What we see in the social sciences in general, but particularly criminology, is probably a very filtered view of what ultimately is submitted for publication and what ultimately comes out in terms of published research.
Yeah, I mean, because there's no end customer who is determining sort of the value of the material, it is like if the horse and buggy manufacturers got to decide whether the car got manufactured, they'd probably say no. But it's the customers who kind of override their decisions. But in this situation, there is no sort of third-party customer who is thirsty for the information and will overthrow, in a sense, the biases of those defending an older, or I guess more traditional way of thinking. And I think that's one of the challenges when you don't have the end customer who can bypass the gatekeepers. I think the capacity or the environment where this kind of subtle corruption can flourish seems almost inevitable.
Absolutely, absolutely. And you think the stakes can be relatively high. There's limited page space for journals to publish research. And so if they're publishing on something that's more controversial, they're not publishing stuff that's less controversial, or that falls in line with what most people believe. And if you think about the editors, most of the editors are well respected in the field. That's how they got elected or ultimately got to the position of being an editor. And what happens when they're confronted with research that goes against them and what they believe and what many of their friends and colleagues believe? If they publish it, they may think, whether correctly or incorrectly, that they're sort of putting their stamp of approval on it, and others will look at them and they'll lose that status. They'll lose the way that people view them, and it could be a cycle. Absolutely.
And why I think there's, obviously, you know your field infinitely better than I do, but from the outside, Dr. Beaver, why I think there is such high stakes is not just people's individual careers, but, biosocial criminology is something that impacts society outside, and in particular, questions of racism or bigotry and so on, because we did a presentation last fall called The Truth About Crime. And we sort of pointed out that crime is not evenly distributed among ethnicities. And also there are other potentially genetic constituencies of those ethnicities that are also not evenly distributed, such as an IQ, and we talk about the warrior gene and so on. So there is, of course, the internal ambitions, but, as we've seen from people in the past, people like Richard Lynn or, of course, Charles Murray, Jason Richwine, and so on, people who have decided to bubble up some of the human biodiversity challenges that society might be facing. There is a significant backlash, in particular from the media, who are generally populated by people on the left and who are environmental determinists, so to speak. So I think there's that aspect as well that is keeping this conversation away from the general public at a time when I think it's more desperately needed than ever.
Sure. I wouldn't disagree at all. When you're talking about crime, you're talking about a behavior that everybody seems to care about and that everybody is an expert in. And I always tell my students this, that, when someone asks you and they say, oh, you're studying criminology, everyone will be an expert when it comes to crime. They'll tell you what causes crime, why crime went up, why they were robbed, why this happened, without ever asking you, without really even caring. They already have their ideas in their mind about what causes crime, and it's not going to change, at least for most folks. And so it is an interesting topic to pursue from sort of a scholarly or academic perspective, because of the quote-unquote everybody's an expert mentality when it comes to it.
Well, and that's, of course, called the Dunning-Kruger effect. And trust me, Dr. Beaver, it's not any different in the realm of moral philosophy, where people who haven't studied it will tell you exactly what right and wrong is and exactly why. And people who aren't good at stuff generally lecture the experts with no self-consciousness as to how uninformed they are. It's just one of the crosses you have to bear when you become an expert in something.
Right.
So you've written, and I thought this was a great sentence, which I think we should break down if we can. The continued advancement of the biosocial perspective, particularly the continued uncovering of new and important pieces of information about the causes of crime, rests on two key factors: the collection of biosocial criminological data and the development of biosocial theories that piece together the known biosocial findings. Now, that's probably a little bit opaque to a lot of my listeners. I'm not saying it's perfectly clear to me either, but could you help people sort of understand how rapidly, I guess, particularly with the Human Genome Project, and of course the gathering of additional data like the longitudinal studies of youth and so on, what is driving the acceleration of insights and connections coming out of biosocial perspectives?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I think the context within which I wrote that is that if you look across all fields of study, so say we're looking across criminology, sociology, psychology, psychiatry, and so on, what you see is differential focus on genetics. So in sociology, there's no discussion of genetics. In criminology, there's very little. In psychology and psychiatry, you see a significant amount more research devoted to that line of research. And so if we're just looking in criminology, what happens is that the journals do not publish much research that's devoted to or that examines genetics or biosocial contributors to crime. There are a number of reasons for that. I've seen people write that, well, if they're not interested in it, they'll leave it to biosocial criminologists to study. But one of the more common sort of knee-jerk reactions is that, well, this is a very interesting line of research, but there are no criminological data sets that include that type of information on a widespread basis. So the argument is that we have all these criminological data sets that are out there, but most of them don't include genetic information or twins or other biological data that could be used to understand more closely the biosocial contributors to criminal behavior. And so I think that the first point that I made in that statement was that we need a more varied and more widely concerted effort to include genetic and biosocial data in every criminological data set that's collected from here on forward. Not only that, many of the criminological data sets that are in existence, we could go back and add genetic markers to them. That would allow a whole discipline to have access to genetic markers, to biological markers that could then be used to test at a much more sort of rapid pace the way in which biological, genetic, and environmental influences contribute additively and interactively to criminal behavior. Because right now, if we leave it up to other fields of study, their focus isn't as much on crime as it is on other types of human phenotypes, things like aggression or violence or dominance-related behaviors, things like that, which may overlap quite significantly with crime, but they're different. Not all aggressive behaviors are criminal. Not all violent behaviors are criminal. And so if we want to really channel our resources, if we really want to fully understand what causes criminal behavior, we have to begin by changing the types of data that we collect. Once it's sort of institutionalized that we collect information from the genome or from other biological correlates to crime, then it will become standard place, and it'll become a lot more, I think people will be a lot more open to it because they'll have those data readily available that they can then analyze and say, oh yeah, I saw this study out there that showed this biological correlate to crime. I have that biological correlate to crime in my data set, and I show the same thing, so I'll need to control for that. Or I think it could fit in, with an interactive effect with this type of environment or whatever. I think it would spawn a lot of discussion, a lot more collaboration, and ultimately, I think we would have a lot more information on the biosocial underpinnings to criminal behavior if we saw something proceed in that fashion.
Right.
Okay, good. So does that make sense?
No, go ahead.
Yeah. Okay, so that was the first part of it. I mean, the second part was about theory, right? Isn't that what you had said? Yeah. So what we need to do then is be able to piece these pieces of information together in a coherent theory, in a theory that would allow us to understand how all of these biosocial correlates sort of fit together to explain crime in general or specific types of crime. Because right now what we have is we have a lot of findings. So, for example, we have found that alleles for the MAOA gene differentially contribute to violence. We've shown time and again that around 50 to 80% of the variance in criminal behavior is due to genetic influences. Research has shown consistently that heart rate is related to violence and delinquency. But what we haven't done is sort of sat down and said, okay, what findings, biosocial or otherwise, are consistent across all studies, and then start to lay them out and say, okay, we know that this variable and this variable and this variable and this variable are always found to be related to criminal behavior. And how do these variables fit together in a coherent way that we could then explain sort of the development of criminal behavior and the development of criminals in a way that's based on all this research that's out there. So what we have right now are environmental theories. We have a bunch of criminological theories that are out there that people maintain are correct or in some cases incorrect. And then we have a whole bunch of biosocial studies showing differential effects of these biosocial influences, but these are very separate entities in the sense that environmental theories and biosocial research rarely sort of integrate. And nobody's done anything. I shouldn't say nobody. There have been a few studies that are out there, a few theories that have been set forth, like Lee Ellis's theory, but very little in terms of theorizing on the way in which we could sort of combine these together to get a coherent theoretical explanation that's grounded in biosocial work.
Right. And, just to remind the listeners, this unified field theory of criminology is not deterministic. In fact, without the knowledge, as we talked about earlier, it's deterministic. So when people say, oh, well, we're going to use genetics to explain things, that does not make us passive. That makes us active. Right. If there was a particular gene that caused cancer, we would want to know that and not pray to the gods of political correctness to cure our illnesses. So, sorry, I'm not trying to speak for you. I just want to make sure that because whenever people hear this, oh, it's genetics and we can't do anything about it. It's completely and it's like, no. That gives us the power to do something about it.
Absolutely. And again, I think that's what the tag biosocial should really clearly demonstrate, is that it's not purely biological or genetic. It's a combination of factors, biological and social, that combine together that ultimately predispose to criminal behavior. And genes don't work deterministically when we're talking about complex behaviors like criminal behavior. They work in a probabilistic way. So we might have hundreds or thousands of genes that increase or decrease our probability of engaging in crime, but not a single gene in and of itself, for the most part, would ever say for certain that yes, indeed, this person's going to become a criminal, or no, they're not. And what's more is that many of these genetic effects can be amplified or dampened depending on the types of environments that someone might find themselves in. So an individual with a genetic predisposition to violence, that genetic predisposition may surface when they're in a criminogenic or adverse environment. But you take that same genetic predisposition and you pair it with a different type of environment, one that's sort of more moderate, and that genetic predisposition may never surface. And to go back to sort of a medical example, if you think about it, individuals may vary systematically in terms of their genetic potential for heart disease. And so someone might be, if we took two people and they were both at very high levels of genetics or genetic influence for heart disease, that doesn't mean that the individual should say, oh, you know what, my life is determined. I'm going to die from a heart attack or whatever it might be, so I'm going to go out and live life without any regard for my health. In fact, we would see the opposite. We would look and say, okay, this individual is at very high risk, genetically speaking, for heart disease, so let's monitor them. Let's make sure that they go to the doctor all the time, that we get them on certain medications that sort of curtail that genetic predisposition. Make sure they exercise, right? Give them different types of reading materials about ways to counteract, high risk for heart disease, eat healthy, so on and so forth. And so in this way, as you had mentioned before, knowledge is power. If we know that we're genetically predisposed for something, whether it's cancer, heart disease, or crime, presumably we're in a position where we can do something about it. I mean, same thing holds for behaviors like addiction. If we know that addiction, say alcoholism, runs very rampant in our family, then we're in a position where we can abstain from alcohol, and then that genetic predisposition would never have a chance to surface. Or we might monitor ourselves very closely and sort of keep a log on how much we're drinking to make sure that we're not going down that road. But no matter what we look at, it doesn't matter whether genetic predisposition makes us feel good or makes us feel bad. It doesn't change the fact that the research indicates that genes matter for virtually any type of behavior, from criminal behavior to impulsive types of behavior. And knowing more and more about that should put us in a position where we can do more and more about it in a way that's quite effective.
Yeah, I mean, the closest thing to determinism that I can think of is genetic predisposition plus negative environment plus ignorance of the genetic causes. That to me would be the closest thing. Now, you had mentioned something that I'd not heard of before. Not that I'm some massive expert in the field, but when people sort of ask me criminality and so on, I say, oh, well, okay, there's already cultural influences, but there's where the stuff is a little bit beyond our control. We're talking IQ, gender, adrenaline, and testosterone in particular, and so on. But you also mentioned heart rate. I've not heard of that one before. How does that manifest?
Yeah, it's a very consistent finding. I haven't published directly on that. Adrian Rain has, and one of my former students, Brian Boutlaw, published on it. But it's a very consistent finding indicating that low resting heart rate is an indicator for more antisocial behavior. And the precise reason for that is, to my knowledge, not fully understood, though there's been a lot of sort of discussion about why that might be the case, that they're less likely to be affected by the types of behaviors. Or, you think about people who are nervous, right? I wouldn't want to go rob a bank because for many reasons, but one of them would be I probably would hyperventilate when I'm going into a bank thinking, oh my gosh, what happens if I get caught, or this or that or another thing. Whereas other people just might be pretty cool and collected, and that might not really bother them that much. So the finding is consistent. The rationale or the explanation for the mechanism that links heart rate to criminal behavior is probably not as well agreed upon.
Oh, it just reminds me of that old song, "Don't Worry, Be Happy." I remember seeing someone wrote somewhere, "Don't worry, be a dummy." And and part of me sort of thought, okay, well, maybe there's an IQ relationship that the more intelligent you are, the more you can sort of see around the corner of consequences,
Sure.
and the more you could potentially anticipate bad things. So maybe if you're not worried about anything, it's because you're really not thinking of any, I don't know, just a possibility. Now, let's turn to the big question, one of the biggest questions, I think, in the U.S., which is ethnic crime rates, which are, of course, as you know, the East Asians, the Japanese, the Chinese, the South Koreans, and so on. I guess maybe the North Koreans, if they were allowed out of their prison country, but they, of course, called the model minority, lower than Caucasians or whites in terms of criminality, welfare consumption, family breakup, and so on, and child abuse. And then there's Caucasians, and then, of course, Hispanics have a higher rate of crime than Caucasians. And American blacks, if not blacks around the world, have truly shockingly high levels of criminality. Now, the general explanation is, slavery plus racism plus poverty, whatever it is, just creates this unholy brew. But as far as I understand it, there are significant contributions that your field can make to helping people to untangle why there are such differences in ethnic positive and negative behaviors in society.
Yeah, I think that this is one of the key areas, understanding sort of minority, non-minority differences in crime rates, more specifically white versus African American differences. And I think it's also one of the reasons that people are so concerned about biosocial criminology. And that's that, well, if you're studying biology, you're studying genetics, and you're trying to explain crime, then it necessarily leads to the question of how this accounts for, how does biology or how do genetics account for